Story 1. Something someone said to me today reminded me of this tale, and I thought some of you would appreciate hearing it. So, this is my grandmother's story. My family has been telling the tale for decades. Grandpa himself told it to his daughter's fiancé as a lesson in not underestimating his new bride. Grandma told it slightly differently to my mom when she and my father were engaged. This is somewhere between the two versions. It's a lesson in be careful what you wish for, as you just might get it. Personally, I've always thought that it was hilarious. My grandparents were very old school. Grandpa got a job working for John Deere as a teen and worked his way up the ladder to foreman, then manager. Grandma was a typical housewife in the 1950s and was held to typical housewife standards. She was to cook and clean and be prepared to entertain Grandpa's business associates at a moment's notice. It was her job to make sure the children were taken care of and never got in her husband's way. She was expected to have dinner on the table at 5:30 sharp. When he got home from work, her house and herself were to be impeccably kept at all times, etc. They were progressive and well off enough that Grandma had her own car. She was expected to use it to run the household errands and take the 4 kids to appointments and such. It was important that her husband not be bothered with such things. The household and family were her responsibility. He had a job. Well, one day, Grandpa arrived home from work, and not only was dinner not on the table, but Grandma wasn't even there. The kids, teens at the time, hadn't been fed. Their homework was still on the kitchen table. There were unwashed dishes in the sink, and a dozen other little chores hadn't been done yet. Most importantly, Grandpa was inconvenienced. He'd been home just long enough to let his frustration stew into anger when Grandma's car pulled into the drive. He began shouting at her before she'd even had the chance to set down her purse or take off her jacket. He ranted about all the things she hadn't done because she was out running around when she should have been home, taking care of the house and making his dinner. He worked very hard all day to provide for the family. Was it too much to ask for a hot dinner when he got home? She'd had a very good reason for not being home, but he never let her tell it, accepting no excuses. But she was a good wife, so she intended to let him vent for a while. Then she would serve him supper and explain what had gone wrong. Then Grandpa screwed up. As sometimes happens when we speak in anger, he begins to blame the wrong thing for his irritation. He began to blame the car and her access to it. He said something to the effect of, "You don't have any business out driving around anyway. You should be home. I should never have let you start driving in the first place. Women shouldn't drive." "You don't want me to drive?" Grandma asked calmly, retrieving her keys from her purse. "Fine. Then I won't drive ever again." And she set those car keys on the counter, put her things away, and served dinner. And bless her heart, Grandma stuck with that declaration, no matter how much more difficult it made life. Grandpa had to take afternoons off in the middle of the week when a teacher scheduled a meeting. He didn't get a moment's peace on the weekends, between grocery trips and taking the kids to activities or doctor's appointments or for haircuts or clothes. He had to drive Grandma to every Saturday salon appointment. Previously, Grandma had taken herself and the kids to church, letting him sleep. Now he had to wake up early on Sundays to take them all by himself. Grandpa was nearly as stubborn as his wife. He held out, expecting her to apologize and ask for her keys back. She never did. Instead, she simply rearranged the household schedule so that he could handle all the driving. Months later, after never getting a single weekend to relax, after having dinner pushed back nearly every day because he had to drive someone someplace, he finally gave in and apologized. He tried to tell her that he was wrong and that she should start driving again. He tried to tell her that he now appreciated all she did to make his life easier. He all but begged her to take those keys. I suspect that Grandma had always disliked driving because she never did take back those keys. Nothing Grandpa said or did could convince her to get back behind the wheel. He'd said she had no business driving a car, and she was going to hold him to that declaration, no matter what. For over 50 years, until the day she died, Grandma never drove a car again for any reason. Not after the kids graduated and moved out. Not after Grandpa retired. Even after Grandpa's death in the 80s, she still refused because my husband always said that women shouldn't drive. Ida, a lot of people are asking, and some seem very confused. I haven't even managed to read all the comments yet. I'm really glad so many liked the story, so I'm copying the answer I gave in one of the comments here. As to the reason for the whole argument and why Grandma was late that day. Sadly, as with the start of most epic arguments between married persons, the details of the triggering cause have been lost to time. Grandma, telling the story 40 years later, recalled that it had been one of those days for her. She'd been making dinner and had it nearly ready when she'd discovered that she'd forgotten to buy something that seemed vital at the time. So she'd stepped out to fetch it, and one thing led to another until a 10-minute trip turned into nearly 2 hours, accounting for car trouble. The only part of said trouble that she recalled clearly was a flat tire, and only because Grandpa had to take the car to the shop to have the tire repaired later that week, and he'd grumbled about how it was just another example of why women shouldn't be driving. I'd also remind people that this was a completely different era. The argument was 70 years ago now. My grandparents were children of the Great Depression. This comment was actually very accurate. Watch some television from the 40s and 50s, and you'll get a better understanding of the dynamic. My grandparents loved each other dearly for their entire lives. Piecing things together long after the fact, the entire family is pretty sure Grandma never liked to drive. She was less than 5 feet tall, a tiny woman to be sure. Don't forget how cars were built in the 40s and 50s. Grandpa had initially pushed her to get a license, and he bought her a car. Many women of that era never drove or only learned to drive very late in life, when cars got easier to handle. That being said, I do agree that this is hardly the healthiest way to end an argument. However, that was never the intent of the story. Story 2. Trigger warning for self-harm. I was in the Navy, stationed at the submarine base in Connecticut. During my time there, I had a friend I met during boot camp, and we ended up in the same class for our specialized training, known as a school. Let's call him Bill. Bill wasn't exactly the image of peak physical fitness. He was short, somewhat chubby, and wore glasses. But what Bill lacked in physical prowess, he more than made up for in intelligence. As a sonar technician in training, he showed an exceptional aptitude for the job. His pragmatic approach to challenges made him a great friend, and I knew he would have excelled in the fleet if he had made it that far. While we were in training, we had 2 petty officers who took their roles as fitness enforcers way too seriously. Despite the nature of our jobs, which were math and computer-focused rather than physical, these 2 seemed to think we were training for elite combat roles. Physical training was scheduled 3 times a week. Most of us managed to keep up, but Bill occasionally lagged behind on runs or didn't meet their overly aggressive standards. It's worth noting that Bill consistently passed the official fitness requirements. In fact, he once received recognition for his effort during a physical training session from a senior enlisted leader. However, these 2 petty officers ignored that and relentlessly criticized him. They called him lazy, useless, and even suggested he shouldn't be alive. It was unrelenting verbal abuse. Things escalated when Bill injured his knee from pushing himself too hard during these exercises. He saw the base doctor, who put him on light duty so his injury could heal, complete with official paperwork. But the petty officers disregarded his medical status, threatening to kick him out if he didn't continue with their workouts. Bill, under immense pressure, kept pushing himself, worsening his injury and deteriorating his mental health. At the time, mental health services weren't easily accessible in the Navy. The only available option was the chaplain, who is essentially a religious leader like a pastor or rabbi and also a commissioned officer. Our chaplain, a kind and empathetic woman who held the rank of captain, was known for her genuine care for sailors. Bill scheduled a meeting with her to discuss what he was going through. When he informed the petty officers about this, they berated him further. They accused him of being weak and claimed the chaplain wouldn't care about his issues. They threatened to make his life even more difficult if he missed class for the meeting. Feeling defeated, Bill canceled his appointment. That same night, Bill's girlfriend broke up with him, adding to his emotional strain. At around 3 a.m., I got a call from him. There was no sound on the other end, and I repeatedly asked if he was okay. Assuming it was a pocket dial or a drunken mistake common among sailors after tough days, I eventually hung up and went back to sleep. I've regretted that decision ever since. The next morning, chaos erupted. Bill's ex-girlfriend called me and a few of our other friends to inform us he was in the hospital because he had attempted to take his own life by cutting his throat. Evidently, Bill had called several of us during his distress, but couldn't speak due to blood loss. After completing our duties on base, we rushed to the hospital. On our way in, we encountered the chaplain, who was leaving. She assured us that Bill would recover and told us she wouldn't forget what had happened. I'll never forget the expression on her face. For someone so kind and composed, the sheer anger in her eyes was shocking. It was clear she was determined to hold someone accountable. When we saw Bill, he could barely speak, but he recounted the events leading up to his attempt. He explained how the constant pressure, the verbal abuse, and the breakup had pushed him to the edge. Miraculously, the cold weather that night had caused his blood to clot, essentially saving his life until emergency services arrived. The doctor told him he had narrowly missed severing a major artery. A week passed without any updates until we were called in by the chief of the training command. He wanted to ensure the rest of us were coping well and to gather any additional information about the petty officer's behavior. My friends and I shared instances of their misconduct, which included lies and other questionable actions. While the chief listened attentively, it was clear that decisions about their fate had likely already been made. The next day, the 2 petty officers were gone, replaced by new instructors. Curious, I visited the chaplain to ask what had happened. She revealed that she had reported their actions directly to the admiral overseeing the base, demanding their immediate removal. The admiral complied. Both petty officers were discharged under conditions that severely limited their future prospects. Although their discharges weren't technically classified as dishonorable, they were still bad enough to exclude them from military benefits and make finding work extremely difficult, especially with organizations connected to the Department of Defense. One of them had been 2 years away from retirement, and the other had served for over a decade. Their careers and likely their lives were irrevocably damaged. As for Bill, he made a full recovery. He received a medical discharge, classified as honorable, due to the injuries he sustained. This granted him lifelong benefits, including counseling services in his home state, all covered by the Navy. His discharge was attributed to his knee injury rather than his mental health struggles, likely as an act of compassion by those handling his case. Bill and I eventually lost touch, but I saw updates about him on social media years later. He had turned his life around, becoming a police officer and getting married. It was heartening to know he found happiness and stability after everything he endured. Reflecting on the ordeal, it's clear the chaplain's actions were instrumental in holding those petty officers accountable. Her determination to ensure justice not only protected others from similar treatment, but also served as a powerful reminder of the importance of empathy and leadership in any organization. Story 3. I'm a paramedic. A few months ago, we're coming back from a routine patient transfer when at an intersection about 4 blocks from the base, I noticed a woman sitting on the side of the road with her arms wrapped around herself and her head down. I nudge my partner who's driving, and we flip on the lights and I see her head come up real fast, and she looks terrified. I get out and she relaxes when she sees the ambulance. After I approach, I notice bruising on her wrists and other similar signs of domestic abuse. She seems hesitant to get up off the curb and into the ambulance, so I decided that I would at least pull the cot out of the back and give her something a little more comfortable than concrete to sit on. Now a few important details. All the cots in my service are Stryker-powered cots. You've almost certainly seen these before. They're bright yellow with black handles and side panels. These cots have a motor and battery built in to allow us to raise and lower the cot at the touch of a button, instead of throwing out our backs having to physically lift the cot up after loading someone. They're usually paired with an automatic loading system built into the ambulance that lifts the cot up to the right height to be pushed inside and also secures the cot when loaded. There's a little red tab at the end of the track, just inside the doors, that you press down to free the cot and allow it to slide out. When you press this tab, it simply releases the cot and the loading carriage it's connected to, and it's up to you to keep it under control until it reaches the unload position and locks into place again. This can be problematic because these cots weigh about 125 pounds, about 55 kg. As soon as I hit the release tab for the cot, I hear lights and sirens behind me. It's a city police car, which is weird because we had not yet requested police, and we were outside the city, in the sheriff's department jurisdiction. We merely informed dispatch that we were stopping to check on a woman at such and such intersection. The woman says something along the lines of, "Oh God, he's here," and moves faster than me, seeing free food being distributed at base. She dashes past me and pretty much hurls herself into the ambulance, sitting on the bench seat. The cop is approaching, and he's pissed. I put 2 and 2 together and slam the ambulance doors shut. Let's call this officer Police Officer Steve. "Is that is she in there?" "Who?" I ask him, confused. "You know damn well who I am talking about." "You mean my patient? I'm afraid I haven't gotten a name yet." "Open those doors, I need to talk to her." "You're not using my rig as an interview room. You can talk to her at the hospital." We went back and forth like this for a few minutes. My partner at some point came back to see what the holdup was, but overheard my stonewalling and went back to the cab to call our chief. I continue my routine of denial and delay until a pair of deputies, likely specifically requested for this by the chief, arrive. Oh good, now I have witnesses. See, we had stopped on an upwards incline. I had hit the release tab on the cot, and it wanted to slide back. I had to close the doors so swiftly, I didn't bother pushing the cot back against the stops and locking it in place. Emboldened by the presence of 2 deputies, he gets in my face. "Get out of my way, or I'm going to have to charge you with obstruction." "Okay." I step out of his way, and he opens the double doors. Between the cot, the monitor, and the jump bag, I'd say there was probably close to 160 pounds contained by those doors, all of which comes barreling out and hits the police officer square in the chest. He goes backwards and falls on the ground. One of the deputies laughs aloud. The other walks up and kneels down beside the guy. He says, "Your shift captain is going to be here in 5. I wouldn't be here then if I were you." He then gathers himself up and scowls at me, then stomps off. There is a limited amount that I can say about the aftermath, as the trial is not settled yet. But we all know how well charges stick to cops. The woman is now living elsewhere, the cop is still a cop, and I have been getting pulled over at least twice a week ever since then. But the video footage of him getting body checked by that cot remains one of the best things I have seen. Edit. For clarification. Yes, the woman Wasi's married to this police officer. And yes, he is allegedly responsible for the abuse. Story 4. As a celebration to being fully vaccinated, myself and my family decided we were going to go away for a week to go whale watching. Such a trip needs supplies, so my family heads to the Market of Walls to get groceries and such. So to start, what we were wearing. My mother was wearing a blue dress with short sleeves, trimmed with white flowers design and beige khakis. Oh yeah, she also has a service dog too, vest and all, a brace dog for those who are curious. My father was wearing a gray button-up shirt and black pants. Finally, I was wearing blue jeans and a green shirt that read, I'd make a Zelda pun, but I don't want to try and force it. Service dog, who I will shorten to Doggo, was wearing his service vest. When we entered the Market of Walls, my mother and father went one way, and I went the other way. I was to get things like sunscreen and stuff, while my parents got the food. We were bringing our own food since the food there is super expensive. As such, this part is second-hand from my parents, but I will embellish with the classic Karen troops. They were in the frozen food aisle picking out some burgers and sausages for our grills. They at first heard the classical "excuse me" when choosing between Mazza burgers and BBQ sauce burgers. They had just ignored it, but my mother felt Doggo tugging at the leash, trying to get her attention. Not something he was trained to do, just really smart. Mom turned around and saw our Karen for this story. She was clearly confused by the blue dress and began asking my mom where something was in the aisles. Obviously, my mother said she didn't work there, and this set Karen off. My father heard the conflict and approached them, but the gray button-up shirt made Karen think he was a manager. I wish I could explain more, but as I said, this was second-hand. At this point, Karen must have stepped on Doggo's tail, because as I was heading back to find my parents, I heard poor Doggo yelp loudly, which is out of character for him, and I took off running. I arrived at the scene with my mother trying to comfort Doggo, his tail slightly red from blood, and my mother tending to it. My father arguing with Karen, and an employee, wearing a blue shirt, black pants, and an apron. Coming up, employee is trying to figure out what is going on, and Karen is going on about how disrespectful my mother and the manager are being. The employee is trying to explain the whole concept of us being customers, but Karen wasn't listening. I took the employee aside and asked him to get the real manager and approached Karen. I should note, I run role-playing games, and through that have learned how to improvise. Me. What's going on here? Karen looks at me. Who are you? I'm the manager. What are you doing here? My father gave me a confused look and went to say something, but I stopped him. Karen looked me over, my cheesy t-shirt and all, and scoffed. You're not the manager, you're just some kid. I'm 29. Okay, then what about my parents is telling you they work here? Karen stopped and looked at my parents, and you can see gears turning in her head. My father saw I had things under control, and he went to help my mother, who doesn't work well under stress. Okay, now that you're listening, what happened to Doggo? Karen stuttered. I don't know. That better be true. Doggo is a trained service dog, and is worth probably more than what you make in a year. I need to. No, you are staying right here till the manager gets here. Doggo is hurt, and I want to know why. Karen must have been intimidated into staying, which is a surprise to me, which will be explained later. Eventually the manager arrives. 10 minutes later, guess the situation wasn't urgent enough, along with a pair of police officers who must have been called by someone. Karen tried to defend herself weakly, but all the breeze she had in her sails against my parents were gone. The manager came back and confirmed Karen stomped on Doggo's tail when Doggo got between my mom and Karen. He sat down in front of the two to stand his ground, but he wrapped his tail to his side to keep it out of the way, meaning it looked like on camera Karen also kicked Doggo. I saw red, but let my parents take care of things. They pressed charges on Karen, and the manager paid for our groceries personally, telling us he apologizes, and that he should have banned her earlier. When we got back to the van, I started crying. You see, something I neglected to say was I am not a confrontational person. Seeing Doggo hurt, my mother crying, and my dad about to deck Karen, I snapped, and was actually scared of what I would do. If Karen didn't stand down, I was a bit afraid of what I might have done. Luckily, it didn't come to that. Mom is staying home with Doggo today, while myself and my dad do some running around. She is still shaken up, and we would rather not add more stress to her. Thanks for reading, and sorry it's a bit messy. I just wanted to get this down. I needed to get this off my chest and felt writing about it would help. Court is hopefully going to be after the whale watching trip, but I haven't heard anything about it. Important update 1. Doggo is physically going to be okay. The vet said the scrape, as he described it, is shallow and should heal. Unfortunately, he will be committed to the cone of bravery when not on duty until it heals to make sure he doesn't make it worse. Mentally, well, have no update on that, but he seemed to be normal around family. As for charges on Karen, interference of service animal, willful injury of a service animal, animal abuse, assault, destruction of property, disrupting the peace and more, she is facing upwards to 5 years in prison, minimum. Nothing official has been decided yet, however. Story 5. Backstory, I have to go back a bit for that. In April 2018, it was the last day we had freezing temperatures and heavy snow. On that day, on my way home from work, I had an accident with my 2V6 Ford Focus. I crashed into a driver in front of me because I underestimated the frozen road. Don't worry, neither me nor the driver I crashed into were harmed in any way. His car had a scratch in the back bumper, while my car's front bumper broke at the side. Police were called, we exchanged information, and that was the end of it. So I had to bring my car to the mechanic again, and I had enough of it. I owned the car for almost 2 years and had to make several repairs already. So I thought, whatever, and tried to get a new car. I brought my Focus to a friend of mine, who made a little extra by repairing cars. A co-worker of mine gave me a ride to work until I had a new car. I paid my share for the gas. Now to the present. Around a month ago, I found a new car. Finally. A car dealer had a deal where they would sell cars with daily admission for €10,000, less than the original price. After a short time thinking and some dealing with my bank account manager, I'm now the owner of a 2018 Ford Focus Street Line Sport Edition, completely black except for the roof and the top half of the side mirrors, which were red. The car is great, and when I bought it, he only had around 15 miles. Sorry for the long backstory, on to the actual encounter. After I bought the new car, I put my old Focus up for sale on an app called Auto Scout 24, where everyone can sell their cars for how much they want for it. Of course, depending on age, miles, etc. Most of the damages were fixed. Me and my significant other cleaned it inside and outside, but I knew I couldn't get much for it. So I put the base price at €350 with the option to bargaining. In my first post, I told you that I live in the old town of my home city. So in order to not occupy parking spaces and to avoid parking tickets, I parked my car at my grandma's place in the driveway. Her house is in the countryside, so it won't bother anyone, and I could take good pictures for the ad. 2 days ago, while I was at work, I got a call from an unknown number. The guy left a message that he wanted to take a look at the car. I called him back, told him where the car was, and that we could meet there after my shift was finished. He agreed. After I'm done with my shift, I drove immediately to my grandma's place to wait for him. Cast: entitled dad, entitled son, who is around 17-18, me and my grandma. Me and the entitled dad agreed on meeting 15:30. I was there early, parked next to my old Focus, went inside to tell my grandma I would sell the car today and checked if everything was still all right. The entitled dad and son arrived half an hour later than agreed, explaining the place was hard to find. I shrugged it off because I could tell they were not from around here. So me and the entitled dad take a look around the car. I explain everything to him, fix damages, etc. He asks me about how many miles, the HP, etc., the usual stuff. While I talked with the entitled dad, I noticed that the entitled son wasn't paying any attention. The car was supposed to be for the son according to the dad. The son rather likes to take a look at my new Focus instead. Entitled son: damn, that's a nice ride. Me: thanks. Can I take a ride? Now I'm very picky about my new car, but who wouldn't? And by the way, I had a feeling he didn't have his driver's license for very long. Me: sorry, not happening. I just got the car a few weeks ago. Entitled dad: come on, let the boy have a little fun. Sorry, it's still not happening, and by the way, we were talking about my 2006 Focus, not my new one. But I like this car. You heard him, he likes this one, so how about you sell us this one instead? Yeah, right, and how much would you pay me anyway? Well, the ad said €350. Yes, for the 2006 Ford Focus. Fine, I'll give you €3,000 for the new one. Are you serious? I paid €30,000 for that car, €30,000 was the original price, but with the deal I got it for €20,000. Well, you drove the car for a while, and that's a price drop. Sorry, this is leading nowhere, we are done. I turned to my car, pulled the key out of my pockets, and just wanted to go home. Dad, I want the car. The dad grabs me by the arm. You heard him hand over the keys. Now I'm a little heavy, but I'm still strong enough to fight if I have to. Me. I said no, and I would recommend you let me go now. While my eyes were staring at the dad, the entitled son snatched the keys from my hand, unlocked the car, and jumped in. I immediately freed myself from the dad and ran to the driver's door of my car. The little jerk locked the door so I couldn't get inside. So I did the only thing I could and stood behind my car to prevent him from leaving. He could only back out of the driveway. Me. Tell your kid to get out of the car before I call the police. In the commotion, my grandma came outside. Grandma, what's going on? Me. Grandma, go inside and call the police. They tried to steal my. I couldn't finish my sentence because the dad shoved me aside so his entitled son could drive away. Well, he surprised me. I hit the ground hard and they drove off in my car, while leaving their car behind. I immediately grabbed my phone and called the police. As I mentioned in the backstory, my new Focus was completely black except for the roof and the top of the side mirrors, which were red, which means that cars stood out among the most which are around our home city. It took the police 10 minutes to arrive. One of the officers took my and my grandma's statement, while the other one radioed his colleagues from the neighboring towns the description and license plate of my car. About an hour later, they came back to the house with my car. The two policemen jumped them at sight, pulled them out of the car and cuffed them. The entitled dad tried to talk him and his son out of the situation by telling the police they only did a test drive. The police had none of their BS and escorted them away. They asked me if I wanted to press charges, and I agreed. More importantly, I checked my car for damages. It was around 20 miles more than before, and I found ash and cigarette buns in my back seat. Story 6. So this is a story from my childhood that my father recently recounted for me, which is why I'm posting it here. He said it's one of the proudest moments he's ever had as a father. Our colorful cast: entitled kid, entitled father, my dad, female friend, and me. For a little context, I was a very short and skinny kid who didn't like confrontation. If I was getting picked on, my instinctual reaction was to cry and run away, usually to my father. He kept telling me to stand up for myself, but I didn't. I just kept getting picked on, crying, and then running. This happened most frequently at a local park playground right at the entrance to the trails. One other little kid and his father would frequent the park almost as much as we did, and if the other kid was there, it meant my time at the park would be spent getting shoved and called all sorts of rude names. My father tried talking to his, but the guy had little interest in parenting his own child, including the phrase, "boys will be boys," and, your kid needs to toughen up and say something back. Among the multiple times my dad tried speaking to him about it, it got to the point where I didn't want to go to the park playground anymore. But my father was adamant that I needed to learn how to stand up for myself, so he would drag me along anyways. One of those days, I went to the park with a school friend of mine who happened to be a girl. Our parents joked that we were boyfriend and girlfriend due to how close we were, so we had a fairly strong bond back then. We were playing near the jungle gym and apparently digging into the mulch. I don't know why. My dad never asked, and it was a little under 20 years ago now, so I have no recollection of this story due to my age and how long it's been. Apparently the entitled kid came over, kicked mulch onto me, and started with his usual insulting and pushing. As per usual, I started crying before I ran off to my dad to start tattling on him. This is when things changed. As I was telling on him to my dad, tears strolling down a wailing face, the entitled kid decided he was going to start in on my female friend. He began kicking mulch at her too and pushing her, getting her mad, but he was bigger than either of us. My father says he calmly turned me around, pointed, and said, "Look." He said that if it was possible, my face got even more red, and my breathing went from dry heaving to anger very quickly. He says he watched me storm across the playground, climb to the top of the jungle gym, and scream down at the entitled kid, "You leave her alone," before jumping from it and slamming into him with my body. I assume I was shocked and scared the piss out of him because my father says we both went down. I got on top of him and just started beating on him. Think when Ralphie finally snaps in A Christmas Story, as that's how my father described watching the spectacle. After seeing and hearing me delivering a beatdown on his child, the entitled father grabs my father and says, "Oh my God, your kid is crazy, do something." While standing up to go over and separate us, my father grabbed him back, pulled him onto the bench, and said, No, it was perfectly fine when your son was going after mine, right? Now, we let them settle this? You want to stop it? You and I settle some things first." The entitled father sputtered, likely due to my father being built like a brick-wrecked house, and stayed seated on the bench. My dad says he only let me smack the kid for about half a minute, but given his personality, I would not be shocked if he'd let it happen for a little while longer. My dad came over, pried me off of him, told my female friend it was time to leave, and we did. He took us out for ice cream, dropped my female friend off at her house, and marathon Scooby-Doo with me that night as a reward. If the entitled kid and entitled father did come back to the same park, it was no longer on the same days or at the same times we did according to my dad.